In 2014, an inexplicable occurrence in a sleepy English seaside town left police scratching their heads. One person was found dead, another insane, and a third suffered a bizarre injury. Not until 2 weeks later were the police able to piece together exactly what had happened. Of course, there was a perfectly scientific explanation for the bizarre events that occurred. There always is. Sarah W. was a 43-year-old auditor. Her job was to go into companies and check their accounts, searching for evidence of fraud. She was in the habit of working late into the night, preferring to do at least some of her work long after most of the employees in the company she was investigating had gone home. In September 1996, she was assigned to audit the accounts of a small company that manufactured cables and cable ties. Recently, she had been starting to lose interest in her work and was struggling to get out of bed, even though her unusual working hours meant she often didn't get up before noon. Sarah's 2 children, Lucas and Toby, had grown into strapping young men and were both at university. Her husband was an army officer and spent long weeks away from home. She felt like something was just missing in her life, and she couldn't figure out exactly what that was. She had started seeing a holistic nutritionist to help her get back her former energy and drive. On November 16th, 2014, she arrived at the cable factory around 2 p.m. and began work. There was no indication that anything was particularly wrong at the company. It had simply been selected for a random audit. The staff were all friendly, although the management were clearly a little intimidated by her and probably resented the inconvenience of having to produce all the paperwork she needed to see. By 7 p.m, everyone had gone home except for the director, who was working quietly in his office. Sarah had been allocated a separate, tiny office on the other side of the now dark factory. She had a 7:15 appointment with her nutritionist, a late middle-aged woman named Kathy. As she left for the appointment, she glanced into the dark factory and thought she saw some vague movement in the shadows. Probably just the director looking for something, she thought. Kathy lived in a beautiful old large house in the suburbs, a short drive from the small industrial area where the factory was located. The house had an extensive garden where Kathy grew numerous flowers and herbs and often practiced yoga. Sarah envied her calmness and spiritual attitude to life. At the door, Kathy greeted her like an old friend. Inside, Kathy asked about her problems and how she was feeling and what she was eating. She made some minor adjustments to Sarah's nutrition plan while they drank a herbal tea together that Kathy said was simultaneously calming and invigorating. Then they did some breathing exercises and meditation together. When Sarah left an hour later, she indeed felt invigorated, but also hungry. She stopped at a drive-in fast food outlet on her way back to the factory and bought some chicken nuggets. She felt guilty because chicken nuggets were not in her nutritional program, but her intention was to carry on working for a few more hours, and she needed to fill her stomach. As she entered the dark factory, she noticed the light of the director's office was off. He must have gone home, she thought. Good. She preferred to work undisturbed. But then something caught her eye in the back of the factory, some vague shadow flitting around the machines, making scuffling noises. It had to be the director, but why would he have switched off his office light? Maybe he was just checking all the machines were switched off before leaving. The chicken nuggets had given her a terrible thirst, so she went into her little office, which was equipped with a sink, and made herself a coffee. Again she felt guilty. Kathy recommended avoiding all caffeine, especially in the evening, but the coffee tasted so good, she thought, as she sat down to work. At that moment, a loud clattering sound made her jump. It sounded like the director had thrown something metallic into a heap of other metallic objects, which was, of course, entirely possible. She decided to go and check who was actually there. She stepped out of the office and shouted the director's name. "Roger?" There was no reply, but the scuffling continued and the shadows continued to flit around. It occurred to her that the mysterious shadow in the back of the factory might actually not be the director at all. What if a thief had broken in? And what if the thief was violent? Thinking quickly, she decided to phone Kathy, so she could at least be on the phone while checking the situation out. That might deter whoever it was from attacking her, and she could tell Kathy to call the police if necessary. Kathy knew where the cable factory was located. She dialed Kathy's number, and Kathy answered promptly. "Kathy, I'm at the factory. It's dark, but there's someone moving about in the back. Can I just talk to you while I look who it is?" "Of course you can," said Kathy. "Shouldn't you call the police?" "It's probably just the director," said Sarah. "I'll scream if it's anyone else, okay?" "Okay," said Kathy, laughing. "Roger?" shouted Sarah again. Again there was no reply. She started advancing towards the back of the dark factory, towards the main light switches. "Who's there?" No reply. When she flicked the light switches, the scuffling instantly stopped. "Hello?" She could see no trace of anyone at all. "Must be rats," she told Kathy. "Are you sure there's no one there?" said Kathy. "Pretty sure. Thanks for picking up. I'd better get back to work." "No problem," Kathy replied. "Anytime." Sarah flicked off the lights and went back to her office, but as soon as she opened the office door, she noticed something that horrified her. The entire back wall of the office was crawling with cockroaches, making horrible clicking sounds. Disgusted and repulsed, she backed straight out of the office and slammed the door shut. There was no way she was going back in there. She decided to call it a night. The factory would have been completely dark had it not been for the red emergency lights, which made it mercifully easy to find the exit. But when she got there, she couldn't figure out how to open it. The handle didn't seem to work. The door seemed to be locked. She decided to try the exit on the other side of the factory floor. She was halfway across the factory when she heard scuffling again, and then distinct footsteps. "Hello?" No reply. Shaking, she dialed Kathy's number again, but this time she got only static. Now she was properly scared. "I'm calling the police," she shouted into the gloom, and she dialed 999. That only resulted in more static. Panicking, she made a run for the exit. As she ran, she heard the footsteps pick up pace, heading in her direction. She pushed the crash bar, but the door didn't open. She spotted some sort of grey shape in the corner of her field of vision and froze in terror, but it seemed to disappear as soon as she turned to look at it. Throwing all her weight against the bar, Finally she got the door open and ran for her car. As she ran, she turned to look behind her, afraid she was being followed. Then suddenly she collided with a heavy-set figure who seemed to have come out from nowhere. She screamed. "Sarah, are you okay?" The voice was alarmed but reassuring. It was Roger, the director. "There's someone in there," she stammered. "In the factory," said Roger quizzically. "Yes, and the office you gave me is full of cockroaches." "Oh, I'm sorry," said Roger. "We do have a bit of an insect problem. I thought we got rid of them. I'll go and have a look. Why don't you wait in your car?" Sarah looked around the car park nervously. Her car was the only one there. She couldn't even see Roger's car. She thought about driving straight home, but then what if something happened to Roger? "Okay," she said. "If you're not out in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police." Roger smiled. He clearly thought she was simply hysterical. "That's fine," he said, and strode briskly towards the entrance. Sarah half walked, half ran to her car, got in and locked the doors. After 5 minutes, there was no sign of Roger. Her heart sank. She decided to wait a little longer in case he had simply lost track of time. No way was she going back into the factory. After 10 minutes, there was still no sign of Roger. What if he was simply busy with something? He hadn't actually promised to be out in 5 minutes. She had no idea how long he typically took to check the factory in the evening. Come to think of it, she had no idea why he had even come back. She decided to err on the side of caution and call the police. She dialed 999 and an operator came online immediately without her even hearing any dial tone. Stumbling over her words, she explained the situation. After taking some details, the operator informed her that a police car was on its way and would be there in less than 5 minutes. Then the phone abruptly cut out. She stared at it in surprise. It was out of charge. She thought she'd only charged it up that morning, but she must have not connected it up properly. Even so, she breathed a sigh of relief. The police would be there any minute. After another few minutes, there was still no sign of Roger, but she could see a flashing blue light coming down a nearby road. She opened her car door and immediately heard police sirens. They were clearly taking the matter very seriously. The car would be there in less than a minute. She decided to go and shout for Roger at the factory door. If he was in trouble, maybe she could at least scare off his attacker. When she opened the door, the factory still appeared completely dark, aside from the faint red glows of the emergency lights. "Roger? Roger, the police are here." "Roger? Roger?" "Sarah, I found something. Come here, will you?" She was completely taken aback. Why weren't the lights on? Why hadn't he come out? "Where are you?" "I'm here, Sarah. Come and give me a hand, will you?" He sounded perfectly calm. She stepped nervously into the gloomy factory, peering at the ground for signs of cockroaches. "Over here," he shouted, from the far recesses of the factory floor. "I need a bit of help." The police siren was really loud now. They must just be around the corner. She walked slowly forwards into the gloom. "Here, Sarah, quickly please." She was already halfway across the factory floor. She could see a light coming from behind a curtain now. She walked up to the curtain and pulled it back. Then she froze in horror. Roger was covered in blood and waving a blood-soaked saw. On the floor was what appeared to be a pile of meat. "I caught an intruder," he said. "Actually, this is very fortunate. We need more human material for our experiments." He lumbered clumsily towards her, saw in hand, slipping on blood on the floor. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah." "The police are here," shouted Sarah. "Wonderful," said Roger. "The more, the merrier." She turned and ran. She felt as though she was running in syrup. Her legs didn't seem to work effectively. It seemed to take minutes to reach the open factory door. All the while she was aware that Roger may well be right behind her. When she emerged into the car park, she looked around frantically for the police. There was no sign of them. They had to be there. She had seen them moments ago. Only one road led to the factory, and the police had been on it, heading directly towards her. "Sarah," said a voice behind her. She turned to face him. His hair and beard were matted with blood, and he was smiling lopsidedly. "The police," she began. "The police aren't coming, Sarah," he said. "I have an understanding with them." She shrieked and ran for her car, but her car wasn't there. Roger was still lumbering madly towards her. "Sarah, if I could just explain," he said. Looking around wildly for some place to run to, she spotted an alleyway by the side of the factory. She ran for it, Roger swiveling around and shouting her name at her retreating back. The alleyway was unlit, overgrown with weeds, greasy with oil, and stank of chemicals. If she could only get back to the road, or at least find a hiding place where she could call the police again. As she crashed through the weeds, scratching herself badly, she could hear the deranged Roger blundering after her in the dark. As she neared the end, the alleyway seemed to be blocked by part of an old discarded asbestos roof, leaning against the side of the factory. One side of the alley was formed by the factory wall, and the other by a high fence filled with weeds and brambles. The only possible escape was forwards. In desperation, she ran straight at the old roof and found she could trample and kick it aside, bits of it crumbling around her. On the other side, the weeds were even thicker, but she ran like a maniac, not caring if she was scratched or stung. Behind her, she heard Roger battling with bits of asbestos roofing, still shouting her name. Finally, she reached the end of the alley and found herself on a road. She could see lights in the distance. The road was a single-track lane, full of potholes, but she ran like the wind towards the light. Behind her, Roger continued to call her name, but she could tell she was gradually pulling away from him. Finally, she arrived at a supermarket on the edge of town. The lights were on inside the supermarket, but it was closed and appeared otherwise deserted. The bright lights hurt her eyes, and she had trouble properly seeing into the supermarket. She collapsed against the closed doors, sobbing. Roger was still shouting, gradually getting closer. She felt incredibly tired and also intensely thirsty. Think. Clearly the thing to do was to run for the main road. Roger was on foot, and he wasn't a fast runner. Looking around the supermarket car park, she couldn't immediately see where the road actually was, but a road had to be there. She began to run across the car park, watching behind her to see if Roger had yet appeared. She could see some dark shape taking form in the darkness near the rear edge of the supermarket. She could hear him calling her name, begging her to allow him to explain. Suddenly she heard another voice. "Sarah?" "Oh, thank God," she said. The voice belonged to Kathy. "What's going on?" said Kathy, alarmed by Sarah's scratched and frightened appearance. "I came to see if you're okay, but I got lost." "It's Roger, he's chasing me, he's crazy," said Sarah breathlessly. "Oh my God," said Kathy. "Look, my car's just over there, can you walk?" Yes, said Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "Let's go, run." They ran towards an opening at the side of the car park. They had reached the opening when Roger appeared right in front of them, apparently having somehow gone around and cut them off. "I can explain everything, I just need you to come back to the factory." "I'm not going back to your damn factory," said Sarah. "What the hell is wrong with you? Get away from us." "Just let me explain," said Roger, limping towards them. "Run," said Sarah, grabbing Kathy's arm and pulling her back. Instead of running, Kathy grabbed Sarah's arm in return. "There's no need," she said. "Roger and I go way back." Sarah stirred in shock. "We need human tissue for our experiments," said Kathy. "I'm sorry, Sarah." "No," screamed Sarah, and she pushed Kathy as hard as she could. Kathy fell to the ground, dragging Sarah with her. Sarah knew that if she could just get Kathy off her, she could outrun Roger. She tried to slam Kathy's head against the tarmac, but Kathy kept a firm hold of her. Roger stumbled steadily closer. "Hold her, Kathy," he said. "She's perfect experimental material." Kathy tried to get to her feet, holding Sarah like a crab. Sarah's teeth contacted Kathy's ear, and she bit as hard as she could. Kathy let out a yell and loosened her grasp. Sarah pushed her away and ran past Roger, heading for the main road that was now visible across the car park. She ran, jogged and finally walked for what seemed like miles, beginning to calm down only as she finally saw signs of life around her. Roger had said he had some kind of deal with the police, so she wasn't sure whether she could trust them or not. Neither Roger nor Kathy knew exactly where she lived, so if she could just make it home, she would be safe. But she didn't recognize that part of the town. It looked unfamiliar and strange, and everything seemed curiously blurry. As she was striding down an unfamiliar road, she again heard the sound of police sirens behind her. She quickened her pace and began to look for places to hide, but this time the police rapidly caught up with her. The police car overtook her, pulling onto the pavement and blocking her way. Two burly policemen got out and immediately grabbed hold of her, forcing her hands behind her back. "I'm arresting you on a charge of grievous bodily harm," said one. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later rely on in court." "No," screamed Sarah. "You're with him. Help! Someone help me!" It took the police several days to begin to piece together what had happened. In the course of their investigation, they did indeed uncover a corpse, but the victim had not been killed by Roger. In fact, Roger denied he had been present or involved at all after leaving the factory around 7:30 p.m. The police were able to verify that Sarah had indeed left the factory around 7:15 p.m. and had indeed visited Kathy. When they turned up at Kathy's house to ask her some questions, they made a disturbing discovery. They found Kathy dead in her garden, and she had been there for some days. They came close to charging Sarah with murder, but while building their case, other difficult facts emerged. Kathy had made a phone call to her sister 10 minutes after Sarah had left. On the phone call, she had asked her sister to bring her some orange juice, which was very strange because her sister lived a long way away in Scotland. She had been repeatedly distracted during the call by what her sister had assumed to be a group of friends or perhaps clients. Her sister hadn't heard any of these people herself, but Kathy repeatedly referred to them and kept breaking off the call to talk to them. At the same time, the factory security cameras showed Sarah arriving in her car. She was driving erratically and parked the car half in a hedge. Internal security cameras showed her roaming about the factory floor. Eventually she went outside and sat down cross-legged in the middle of the car park. She appeared to mime making a phone call before re-entering the factory. Then she ran out, screaming incoherently, and disappeared into the alley by the side of the factory. At 9:23 p.m, she attacked a woman in a supermarket car park, almost biting off her ear. The woman's ear had had to be surgically reattached, but fortunately, the operation was largely a success. She had then run off until finally the police located her, running half naked down a busy street, covered in scratches and ranting at passers-by. After arresting Sarah, the police had called in a doctor who had examined her and administered a sedative. The doctor had ordered blood tests, and it was the blood tests that had finally enabled the police to assemble a full picture of what had occurred. Sarah herself retained only a fragmentary recollection of any of these events after the sedation had worn off, and the story from her point of view was pieced together from these fragmentary memories by a police psychiatrist and from statements she had made at the police station when first arriving. It emerged that Kathy was not only a nutritionist but a keen amateur herbalist. Unfortunately, her eyesight was bad due to glaucoma, and her sister later attested that Kathy believed that no natural substance could be truly harmful. The herbal tea she had shared with Sarah contained a variety of herbs from her garden and possibly ordered off the internet, but whatever it contained, and for whatever reason, she had incorporated henbane leaves into the brew. A supply of dried henbane leaves, roots and seeds was found in a drawer in her house, suggesting she thought henbane a perfectly reasonable ingredient of herbal tea. That it is not. It can only be speculated that she had mistaken it for something else. Henbane contains several potentially deadly tropane alkaloids, including hyoscyamine and scopolamine. Scopolamine had been trialled by intelligence agencies as a truth serum but discarded because it really only produces delirium. Both substances have legitimate uses. For example, hyoscyamine in tiny doses can alleviate travel sickness, but in large doses both are deadly deliriants and can cause permanent brain damage or death. The late neurologist Oliver Sacks described an experience he once had with scopolamine. He had a conversation with a spider which seemed completely normal to him at the time, and talked extensively with a group of friends who it later turned out were not present at all. While these alkaloids do have noticeable side effects such as a very dry mouth, one of the most disturbing things about them is that when under the influence, people cannot tell hallucination from reality. Therefore, they cannot even be sure when the effect of the substances has worn off. Under the influence of henbane, Sarah had hallucinated all of the subsequent disturbing events after she returned to the factory. Neither Kathy nor Roger had been present at all after she had left Kathy's house. Unfortunately, one of her hallucinations had weaved itself around a real person. She had attacked and bitten the ear of a random shopper, believing her to be the evil version of Kathy. The supermarket had actually been open. Sarah's dilated pupils and confused brain had simply not perceived the fact. Sarah made a full recovery with only minor lingering side effects for a few weeks after the incident. No charges were filed against her, since she had neither been in touch with reality at the time of the attack, nor had she voluntarily taken the henbane. She had believed she was drinking a harmless herbal tea. Kathy was not so lucky. She may have ingested an even larger dose than Sarah and had completely lost her mind. She had taken to grazing like a goat on random plants in her garden and had eaten more henbane and also some foxglove leaves. Foxglove contains a cardiac toxin, and she had died in her garden of a heart attack, utterly insane. We will never know what bizarre ideas were present in her mind when she died. Thanks for listening. If you like this story, please like, comment, subscribe, and also build a 10-foot high statue of Chairman Mao out of your own toenail clippings. It really helps me when you do that.